We now have the ability to save records in our private database. Next, we're going to retrieve those expense records and display them in a table view.
Let's navigate to the expenses view controller, and let's create a new function. This function is going to be called every single time that we want to retrieve expenses from CloudKit. So what should we call this, Dale? Query records?
Query expenses.
Expenses. And that's going to not take any parameters, and it's not going to return anything. So in here, to query CloudKit, you need a CK query object. So let's create a new constant, and let's call that query. Let's set that equal to a CK query. When you initialize a CK query, you need to know both the record type that you're querying and a predicate. So the record type is the same record type that you gave it on the single expense view controller. In our case, expense. And what is a dead predicate, Dale?
It is like a query. It is a way of stating what it is that we want. In this case, we're going to do a very minimal query that essentially says we want all the expenses.
So this would be our opportunity to actually limit the records that we want returned. But since we want them all returned, we need to create a new NS predicate with the initializer of value, which is of type bool, and simply pass it true. What this basically says, it will go through every single record that it's about to return and compare it to this predicate. And the predicate simply says, if it exists, give it to me.
And before we continue, we need to point out that this predicate will only work if, and let's go back to our CloudKit dashboard to that particular item and show that we have to set the appropriate field to queryable.
Right, so search for the container, navigate to the correct container, go to the data section in development, record types, make sure your record name is queryable.
And it's not like that by default. In the previous videos we set this, but in case you're dropping in right here trying to figure out how to query and it's not working, this query to get all the records based on a predicate of true needs to have record name queryable.
Exactly, and if you don't have that index, you will get an error popping up in the console later on that says, hey, there's not an index for queryable on record name, you need to add it. So let's go back to expenses view controller, and now that we have our query, let's actually perform this query. And to perform a query on a private database, you access the private database, and it has a perform function. Perform function does a couple things. It needs the query that you're actually performing, the zone in which the data exists, and a completion handler. Again, completion handler will be called after this is asynchronously called through the internet. So let's provide it with the query. And the zone. This zone is the same zone that we created earlier and saved in the view did load, the one with our zone name of expense zone. So let's pass it a zone, and let's access the zone ID. Now that we've passed both of those in, let's implement the completion handler. And since this is the last parameter, I'm going to implement it as a trailing closure by simply double clicking it. And let's give it a name of records and a name of error. If an error occurs while querying this, error object will actually contain a value, else it will contain nil. So if no error happened and the query was successful, records would have an object and error would be nil. So again, this is happening on the background thread. So let's do our dispatch queue.main.async, and let's print out if an error occurs. So if let error equals error, print that error off, else we need to handle the success. So if this was successful, let's save our record somewhere. And normally we would have it in our model, we would have an array of all of our existing expenses. In our instance, let's go to the very top and let's create a new property on this view controller. And let's call this, actually this needs to be a var because we're going to change it a few times. Records equals CK record. We're going to initialize an empty array. Dale, why am I initializing it to an empty array?
Well, the first time this view controller runs, we will not yet have loaded data. This empty array is something against which we can get the count so that we can say there are 0 rows in our table view.
Perfect. So now that we actually have a place to store our records, let's go back to where we're performing our query, and access those records is equal to records.
And notice that we have here self.records inside of a closure that is being called, what do we call that when it's happening after the function?
Escaping?
It's an escaping closure. And escaping closures require that if we access a property of the class we're in, it needs to have self before it.
And this is not the only reason in this instance why we're using self. Because of our parameter name is called records and our property for the view controller is called records, we have to define which we're referring to. I'm getting this error, value of optional type CK record not unwrapped. So, Dale, let's say the query was successful, but for some reason it didn't return any records. Maybe the record type didn't exist or something like that. How would I handle this other than if let records?
Yeah, so we can use the double question mark.
So the nil coalescing operator and give it an empty array.
So this is saying if we're able to unwrap records, we'll use it. Otherwise, we'll use an empty array.
Perfect. So now that we have that, we need to actually tell our table view that it has new data to show. And let's first access our table view. So self.expenses, again, like Dale was referring to, since we're in a closure, we need to make sure we're referring to our properties outside of that closure with self. And then Dale, how do I tell this table view that it has data to reload?
Dot reload data.
Reload data. So essentially what this will do is this will force the table view to call the data source and delegate methods all over again to initialize the table view. So our query, we have our function to query this expenses, but we haven't actually shown these expenses inside of our table view yet. So I'm going to navigate down to the very bottom of this where I'm implementing our UI table view data source function, and let's change this a little bit. Our very first function that we're going to change, number of rows in section. How many rows should I have, Dale?
It's going to be self.records.count.
Records.count. So essentially we want a row per record because each record's going to show each row is going to show its own record. Next, let's change our self row at index path. This is going to provide a cell per record. So let's get the record for that cell. Let record equals records at the index path dot row. So now that we have our CK record, let's actually implement our title and subtitle for this cell. So the cell has its text label, and we need to set this equal to the name of the record.
And I think you mean textlabel.text.
I do mean textlabel.text. Thank you. Now we need to set this equal to the name of our record. To get the name of our record, it's like key value storage. We need to access our record, and the record has a function on it called object for key. This key that it is referring to is the same key that you provided in the single expense view controller to store the object. So for example, names key would be name. If you are unsure what your keys are and you don't have it saved in your actual code at the moment, you could go to the CloudKit dashboard and the key would be the field name shown under the record type. So navigating back to expenses view controller for key name, and let's talk about what this function actually returns. It returns a CK record value optional. The reason why it returns an optional CK record value is what if that key does not exist or you have no value there, so that will return nil. But CK record value is not a string, so we can't actually set the text label's text equal to this. So what do we need to do to this, Dale?
So we need to cast it for what kind of object it actually is. So we're going to say as question mark string.
Perfect.
And we're saying as question mark because it's possible it can't cast it to that type, and therefore it'll result in an optional. And the dot text on our text label is an optional as well, so this is fine.
So our next step is to set the subtitle equal to the date of which this expense occurred. We already have a date formatter in our code, so let's get our date object from the CK record and then pass that through our date formatter to get a pretty printed string of the date. So our very first step is to create an if-let. And let's say if-let date equals, let's access our record. Again, we're going to use the object for key, and then our key for date was simply date. And we're going to cast this as a date object. Now that we have that, let us access our cell.detailed text label dot text is equal to, and then let's access our date formatter dot string from date and pass our date through. Now that we do that, oh, I forgot my question mark. Now it's all happy. If we run this code, we still wouldn't see any records. The reason behind that is because we haven't actually called query expenses yet. So we need to actually call this inside of our code, and probably the best place to do this would be in a view controller lifecycle function. So we can do it in our view did load, but what happens if we navigate from our single expense view controller back to our expenses view controller and we've just added a new expense? So Dale, what view controller lifecycle function should we probably do this on?
View will appear would be a good one.
Yeah, let's do view will appear. This function is obviously called when the view is about to appear, and all we have to do is query expenses. Now that we've done that, we can now build and run our application. And notice how we now have expenses here.
So what happens now if we hit the plus and add a new expense?
So I'm going to add a new expense, click the plus button. I'm going to buy an Apple car. And this is going to be really expensive, say $125,099. And let's click save. Notice how in the console it says record was saved, but what you were about to say something, Dale.
Well, and it didn't appear in our list, and in our view will appear, we should have, and we did, query the database for records. And what is happening here is that there is a time lag between a new record being added to iCloud and it being queryable.
Exactly. So ultimately, and we can even prove it to you by going to the CloudKit dashboard, going over records, clicking query, and notice how it now has 3 expenses, including one for an Apple car, which we just created.
And if we go back and let's hit the plus and then don't do anything and just go back, we see the third one is there. So we're going to need some mechanism whereby while we're waiting for CloudKit to catch up, we add the new record that we knew saved to the list of records that we have, which we'll do in the next video.